The pocket watch ticked against Kate Dawson's ribs every single morning, steady as a heartbeat she no longer had beside her, and on the day she finally let it go, she looked up into a pair of storm-gray eyes that made her wonder if Thomas had sent someone to catch it. The spring of 1882 came to Harlan Creek, Texas, the way it always did, dusty and half-wild, with bluebonnets pushing up through the red clay like they had no sense of the harshness surrounding them. Kate stood at the window of the mercantile she had inherited along with the grief and the debt, and the worn-smooth counter Thomas Dawson had leaned against for 7 years, before a fever took him one January night so quiet and ordinary that she had not even thought to be afraid until the doctor came out of the back room with his hat in his hands. 3 years. 3 years and 4 months, to be precise, because Kate Dawson was a precise woman. She kept the accounts to the penny, swept the porch before the sun was fully above the ridge, and carried that pocket watch in the deep left pocket of her apron every single day. It was a plain thing, as pocket watches went. Brass cased, with a small dent on the back from the time Thomas had dropped it crossing the Pedernales River in the flood year of 1876. The chain had been replaced twice, and the crystal over the face had a hairline crack running from the 6 to the 9. It kept perfect time regardless. Thomas had wound it every morning with the same methodical care he gave to everything, the horses, the ledger, her. And when he was gone, Kate had taken up the winding as though it were a sacred obligation. Perhaps it was. She wound it each morning before she put on her boots. She wound it standing at his grave on the hill behind the church, speaking to the stone in a low voice so the other mourners could not hear her foolishness. She wound it the night the mercantile's roof began leaking, and she sat alone in the kitchen with a pot catching the rain and a Bible in her lap she was too tired to open. Harlan Creek had watched her carry that grief the way the town watched most things, with sympathy at first, then with the particular discomfort people feel when mourning stretches past the length they consider seemly. Mrs. Alderton at the post office had mentioned once that 3 years was a long time. Kate had thanked her for the observation and bought her stamps and gone home and sat in the dark for a while, not crying, just being very still, the way animals in the brush go still when something passes too close. She was 29 years old and she looked it and she did not mind. She was 5 feet 4 inches with brown hair she wore pinned up practically, green eyes that several people in town had described to each other as beautiful when they thought she was not listening, and hands that were roughened from work but moved with a certain economy and grace that Thomas had once compared to watching a good hand rope a calf, efficient and almost musical if you knew what you were looking at. She had no children. This was another thing people mentioned. Not unkindly, usually. Just with that specific gentleness that lands like a stone. The mercantile sat on the main street of Harlan Creek, between the post office and the barber shop, which also served as the town's only dentist on Thursdays when Doc Reeves came through. The town had a sheriff, a livery, a saloon called the Amber Glass that was rowdy on Saturday nights and quiet with shame on Sunday mornings, a church with a good minister named Pastor Howell who kept his sermons short and his opinions on other people's business largely to himself, and a population of roughly 400 souls, not counting the ranches that spread out in every direction into the hill country. It was into this town, on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1882, that Frank Sutton rode. Kate saw him first from the window, the way she saw most arrivals, because the window was where she stood while waiting for the coffee to be ready, and because Harlan Creek did not get so many strangers that the sight of one failed to catch the eye. He came in from the North Trail, which was the Fredericksburg Road, and he rode a big bay gelding with the kind of ground-eating stride that told you the horse had covered serious distance. The man riding him sat easy in the saddle, not slumped, not stiff, just settled, the way men who have spent more of their lives on horseback than oft develop a relationship with a horse that looks almost like relaxation, but is actually something closer to readiness. He was broad-shouldered and lean at the same time, the way working men get, with a dark hat pulled low against the morning sun and a canvas duster that had seen considerable use. He had a rifle in the scabbard and a bedroll behind the cantle, and a pair of saddlebags that looked heavy enough to suggest he was either staying a while or had packed like a man who did not trust the road to supply him. Kate watched him turn the gelding toward the livery and thought no more of it, because strangers came through and strangers moved on, and the coffee was ready. She was unpacking a crate of canned goods when the bell above the door rang at 8:30, and she looked up, and there he was. He was younger than she had guessed from a distance, or perhaps it was the removal of the hat that did it. His hair was dark brown with a little curl to it that he had clearly been fighting for some years. His eyes, which she noticed because he was looking directly at her with the frank attention of a man unused to pretending he is not looking, were gray, not pale gray but the deep gray of river water before a storm. He had a jaw that was angular without being severe, and he had not shaved in perhaps 4 days, and he had a scar along his left cheekbone, thin and old, that looked like it had come from something sharp rather than something blunt. He was, Kate estimated, somewhere around 30 years old, perhaps a year or two either side. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even and came from his chest. "Good morning," Kate said. "What can I help you with?" "I need coffee if you carry it, salt, hardtack or biscuit, whatever you have that travels, and some information if you're willing. Coffee and salt are on the second shelf on your right. I have cornbread that was made this morning. As for information, it depends on the question." He almost smiled at that. It was not quite a smile, more a slight movement at the corner of his mouth, but it acknowledged that she had answered carefully and he had noticed. "I'm looking for work," he said. "Heard the Rocking D spread northeast of town might be hiring." "Roy Danforth's place," Kate said. "He lost 2 hands to the railroad in February and he's been short ever since." "You have experience with cattle." "I grew up on a cattle operation in New Mexico. Been doing various things since, but cattle is what I know." "Various things meaning what?" This time he did smile briefly. "Honest things, ma'am. Scout work mostly, some time with the Army as a civilian guide. A year breaking horses for a remuda outfit in Colorado." "The Army," Kate said. "Civilian contractor. I was never enlisted." He said this without defensiveness, just clarification. Kate nodded and began wrapping his cornbread in paper. "Roy Danforth's place is 4 miles northeast. Take the road past the church until you hit the fork at the big live oak that was struck by lightning sometime around 1877. The right fork. If you miss it, you'll end up at the Reyes property, and Miguel Reyes will feed you and tell you about his grandchildren for approximately 1 hour before you can extract yourself." He laughed at that. A real laugh, short and genuine, that changed his whole face. "Thank you for the warning." "Frank Sutton," he said, and extended his hand across the counter. She took it. "Kate Dawson. This your place?" "It is." "Good store," he said, looking around it with an appraising attention that she recognized as practical rather than idle. He noticed the organized shelves, the swept floor, the careful arrangement of goods by category. "Well kept." "Thank you," she said, and meant it, because she had worked very hard for it to be both of those things, and not everyone who came in noticed. He paid for his goods, settled his hat back on his head, and went out the door. The bell rang his exit. Kate stood still for a moment after it closed, aware of the unusual quality of the silence he had left behind, and then she went back to her canned goods. She did not think much about Frank Sutton for the rest of that day. She thought about him the next day, briefly, when Roy Danforth's wagon came through for supplies, and Roy mentioned in passing that he had taken on a new hand who seemed capable. She thought about him again 4 days later when she saw him in the street outside the Amber Glass, talking to Sheriff Briggs, not drinking, just talking, with his hat in his hands and a calm attentiveness on his face that told her he was a man who listened carefully when he needed to. The first time they had a real conversation was a Saturday, 2 weeks after his arrival, when he came in for more supplies and lingered at the counter with his purchases already counted out, not quite leaving. "You've been here a while," he said. "In this town?" My husband and I came here in 1874. He died in January of 1879. She said it plainly, the way she always said it, because she had found that plainness was kinder than elaboration and spared the other person the awkward dance of finding words. "I'm sorry," Frank said, and the way he said it was different from most people. Most people said it quickly, filling space. He said it with a pause before and after, the way you say something you actually mean. "Thank you," Kate said, and this time she said it without the automatic distance she usually put around that response. "The watch in your apron," he said carefully. "I've noticed you touch it sometimes." Kate looked down at herself, then back up at him, and felt something shift in her chest, not uncomfortably, just noticeably, like a book moved 1 inch on a shelf. She said, "I carry it." "That's a good thing to do," Frank said. Simple, no pity, no discomfort, just acknowledgement. She looked at him for a moment longer than she intended to. "You from New Mexico originally?" she asked. "Born there. Little town called Mesilla in the south. My father had a cattle operation. He died when I was 22. Fever, same as he stopped. Anyway, after that I sold my share to my brother and went looking for something, though I couldn't have told you what. Did you find it?" "Not yet," he said, and the way he looked at her when he said it made her look away first. He came in on the following Wednesday and helped her move a heavy crate that had been sitting at the back of the store waiting for a moment of either help or determination. He simply saw that she had been maneuvering around it, and said, "Where does this go?" and moved it when she told him. Then he bought a tin of tobacco and left without making anything of it. He came in on Saturday again, and this time Mrs. Alderton was there, and Kate watched him be polite to Mrs. Alderton with a patience that cost him something, she could tell. But he did not show the cost, and she appreciated that. He came in on the following Tuesday with a look on his face that she recognized, though she would not have been able to say why, as the look of a man who has been arguing with himself. "There's a dance at the Grange Hall on Friday," he said. "I'm not much of a dancer, I want to be honest about that up front. But I thought you might like to go, and if you go and I go in the same direction, then perhaps we could—" "Yes," Kate said. He stopped. "Yes," she said again. "Friday." He stood there for just a moment with the look of a man who has prepared considerably more argument than he needed, and then he nodded, and she almost laughed. She did not wear black to the dance. She had been wearing black or half-mourning for 3 years, and she had a dress that was a deep green, almost the color of cedar boughs, that she had made for herself 2 winters ago and not yet worn because she had made it during a night of unusual confidence and then not been able to justify the confidence in daylight. She wore it Friday. Frank was waiting outside the Grange Hall when she arrived, having walked the 2 blocks from the Mercantile, and he had clearly made an effort. He had shaved. He was wearing a dark shirt and a string tie and his good hat, and when she came around the corner and he saw her, something happened to his expression that was entirely unguarded and entirely honest, and she felt it like the warmth of stepping out of shade. That's a beautiful dress," he said. "Thank you, you shaved." "I did. It seemed like the occasion." She laughed and he smiled, and they went in together. He had been telling the truth about the dancing. He was not accomplished at it. He was careful and serious about it in a way that was slightly endearing, counting the beats with a faint concentration on his face, and he stepped on her foot twice in the first dance, and apologized both times with a gravity that made her laugh again. By the second dance he had improved slightly. By the third he had stopped counting, and they were just moving together in the warm, fiddle-lit room, and Kate became aware that she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Something more specific, the feeling of being present, of being inside this moment rather than alongside it, watching it from behind glass. They drank the terrible punch the Grange served at these occasions, and they stood near the wall and talked. Frank told her about New Mexico, about the scale of the sky there, wider even than Texas, and about a particular winter in Colorado when the snow had come so fast and so hard that he and a partner had spent 3 days in a lined shack, surviving on coffee and playing cards for stakes that got increasingly imaginative since neither of them had any money. Kate told him about the Mercantile, about the particular satisfaction of the accounts adding up at month's end, about the way the town moved through seasons and the slight different quality of each one. She told him about the river 2 miles south, where the cypress trees stood in the water and made the light come through green in summer. Thomas used to fish there, she said, and felt the familiar weight of the watch in her pocket and felt unexpectedly that the weight was not crushing tonight. It was just there, steady, like a companion rather than a stone. "You don't have to put him away to enjoy this evening," Frank said quietly. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to," he continued, his voice careful and honest. "I just thought maybe you were wondering if you should. You are remarkably perceptive for a man who claims to have spent most of his life outdoors," she said. "Outdoor life gives you time to think," he said, "and I've had considerable time." They walked home to her door, and then he stood on the porch in the April night, and the jasmine that grew up the post was beginning to bloom, and the air smelled green and alive, and his hat was in his hands again, and he was looking at her with those storm-gray eyes that she had been thinking about. She could admit this now to herself, for 2 weeks. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "Whatever you're comfortable calling it." "I'd like that too," Kate said. "Come to the store Monday. We can eat lunch in the back if it suits you." "It suits me," he said. He replaced his hat, nodded once with the particular courtesy of men of that time and place when they are feeling something significant and do not wish to be excessive about it, and went down the porch steps and into the night. Kate stood on her porch for a moment after he was out of sight and touched the watch through her apron. "Well," she said softly, to the jasmine, or the night, or Thomas, or perhaps all three. "All right then." Monday came with a warm southerly wind and the smell of cedar and stone. Frank arrived at noon as she was unlocking the back door that led to the small room she used for keeping accounts, which also contained a table and 2 chairs, and whatever she had cooked that morning. She had made a bean pot with salt pork and cornbread, and there was coffee, and he sat across from her in the small room with the afternoon light coming through the single high window, and they ate, and talked with the ease of people who have passed the first careful stage and arrived somewhere more natural. "Tell me what you're hoping for," Kate said. She was not a woman who approached things sideways when the direct route was available. He looked at her and she watched him consider whether to be careful and decide not to be. "A place," he said. "A real one. I've been moving for 8 years. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of arriving places and leaving them before they get to feeling like mine." He looked at the table for a moment. "I'm 31 years old and the sum of what I own fits on 1 horse. That was fine at 23. It's not what I want at 40. "And what would make a place real?" she asked. He looked up at her. "People in it that I care about, work that builds something, not just passing through. Harlan Creek is a small town," Kate said. "I've noticed. People talk. I imagine they already are." "They are," Kate confirmed. "Mrs. Alderton informed me yesterday that you have a very good reputation among the hands at the Rocking D," which was her way of indicating that she has been investigating you thoroughly. Frank's mouth moved. "Should I be concerned? Not unless there's something she'd find alarming." "There isn't." He said it directly and she believed him, not because she was naive but because she was good at reading people and she had been watching him closely for 2 weeks. "I know," she said. They looked at each other across the small table in the small room, and the wind moved through the high window and brought the smell of spring with it. "I should tell you," Kate said, "that I don't enter into things lightly, not anymore." "I know that," Frank said. "I wouldn't want you to. And I carry what I carry. I don't know if that changes over time. I expect it does, but right now it's still very present for me." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not in a hurry, Kate. I'm just asking if I can keep coming to lunch on Mondays." She felt something loosen in her chest. Something that had been held tight for a long time. "And Wednesdays," she said. "I cook on Tuesdays." "Mondays and Wednesdays," he said. "I'll count on it." The spring moved through its calendar in the way of hill country springs, extravagant at first, then settling into the long, slow warmth that would eventually harden into summer. Frank came to the store on Mondays and Wednesdays with the reliability she had always found deeply comforting in things and people. He helped when there was something to be helped with and sat at the table in the back room when there was not, and they talked. He was not a man who talked for the sake of sound, which suited Kate, who had always found silence more comfortable than many people seemed to. But when he talked, it was worth hearing. He had read considerably more than most men who had spent their lives working outdoors, and he explained this once by saying that his mother had been a school teacher and had considered reading non-negotiable regardless of what else a person was doing with their life. "Is she still living?" Kate asked. "Died the same year as my father. Influenza. We lost them within 3 months of each other." He said it simply, not dragging it out, but she saw the old sorrow in his eyes, settled there so long it had become part of the landscape of his face. "That must have been very hard," she said. "It was the kind of hard that either breaks a person or teaches them something," he said. "I'm still deciding what it taught me." Kate understood that answer in her bones. She began to look forward to Mondays and Wednesdays with a specificity that surprised her. Not just the week, but the hour, the approaching of noon, the sound of his step on the back porch, the particular quality of his knock, 3 times even, which was courteous and familiar at the same time. On a Wednesday in May, she was in the middle of explaining the complexity of ordering stock from the San Antonio suppliers when she realized she had been talking for some time without stopping, which was unusual for her, and she looked up and found him watching her with an expression of such attentive warmth that she stopped in the middle of a sentence. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Keep going. I like listening to you figure things out." She looked at him for a moment. "Frank Sutton," she said. "Kate Dawson," he said back, in the same tone, and they both laughed. And it was the kind of laughter that comes from the recognition of something understood. He held her hand walking home from the June barn social, which was not quite the same caliber of occasion as the April dance, but was attended by most of the town, and therefore served the function of making things, as Mrs. Alderton said pointedly to Pastor Howell over Sunday dinner, official. Kate did not mind official. She minded pretense, and she minded pretending she was not glad to be walking beside Frank Sutton in the summer dark with his hand holding hers, steady and warm. In July he fixed the leak in the mercantile roof, which he had noticed in May and mentioned twice, before she admitted it was a problem. He spent a Saturday up there with a bucket of pitch and some cedar shingles, and she brought him water at mid-morning and stood at the base of the ladder looking up at him, and he looked down at her, and the sun was full and hot, and she felt a fullness in her chest that she had genuinely not expected to feel again. "Thank you," she called up. "Roof like this needs attention twice a year," he called down. "I'll do it again in October." It was the first time either of them had said anything that presumed this far forward, and they both heard it, and he held her gaze for a moment, and she did not look away. He told her about the year he had spent as a civilian scout for the Army in the Southern Territories, guiding patrols through Apache country. He told her what he had seen, and he told her with the clarity of someone who had thought carefully about what he had witnessed and arrived at conclusions that were not comfortable but were honest. "It wasn't justice," he said. "Any way you look at it, those were people's homelands. The reasons given were always about settlement and safety, but the reality was land. Just land and power." He shook his head. "I've had trouble sleeping easy about my part in it ever since." "Did you try to stop anything?" Kate asked. "When I could. I turned away from 2 contracts after I saw what the objectives really were. Got a reputation as difficult." He looked at the table. "Not as difficult as I should have been, probably." She reached across and put her hand over his on the table, and he looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would unknow what he knew, but she wanted him to know she had heard him. "You're a decent man," she said. "I try to be," he said. "That's all I can say with certainty. That's more than most." By August they had gotten to the point where the town had long since decided what they were to each other, ahead of either of them having said it plainly. Roy Danforth clapped Frank on the shoulder and said something gruff and approving about the Dawson woman that made Frank both embarrassed and glad. Pastor Howell mentioned to Kate that he was glad to see her looking well, which was his version of an endorsement. Kate's friend Lily Reeves, who was the doctor's wife and the only woman in town whose company Kate had sought with regularity since Thomas died, said it more directly. They were sitting on Kate's porch on a Sunday evening in August with lemonade and the last of the day's heat, and Lily said, "You're in love with him." Kate was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I believe I am." "How does it feel?" Kate thought about it. "Like being cold for a very long time and then standing next to a fire," she said. "But also frightening, because you remember how cold it was." Lily reached over and put her hand on Kate's arm. "Thomas would not have wanted you to stay cold." "No," Kate said, "he would not." She touched the watch through her pocket as she had thousands of times and sat with the truth of it. "He would have liked Frank." "He would have," Lily agreed. "He would have liked anyone who looked at you the way Frank Sutton does." Kate looked out at the August evening, at the dry hills and the purple sky and the early stars beginning to appear, and she let herself feel both things at once, the sorrow and the gladness, not choosing between them because she had learned over 3 years that grief and life were not opposed to each other. They simply existed in the same body, which had to learn to hold both without letting either one crowd out the other. That night, alone in the house, she took the watch out and held it in both hands and sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight. "Thomas," she said quietly. The house was still. The cricket song came through the window. The lamp made a warm, small circle in the dark room. "I am not forgetting you," she said. "I want you to know that I will not forget you, but I think I might be ready to." She stopped, tried again. "There is someone, he is a good man, and I think I might." She held the watch tighter. "I am still here," she said. "I am just also there, with him, a little." She sat for a long time and then she wound the watch, because she always wound the watch, and she put it back in her pocket and went to bed, and she slept with a quiet she had not had in a long time. In September, things shifted in the way that important things sometimes shift, not with drama but with the weight of accumulation reaching a tipping point. Frank came to lunch on a Wednesday and ate his food in a quiet that was different from his usual quiet, which was comfortable, and Kate noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked. He put down his fork. "Roy's offering me a permanent position, foreman of the North Section. Year-round salary, a permanent bunk in the foreman's cabin, and a stake in the operation eventually if things go well." "That sounds like what you were looking for," Kate said. "Part of it," he said. He looked at her with the direct, unguarded look she had come to know. "Kate, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that I'm not putting pressure on anything. Whatever you say, I'll hear it." "Ask," she said. "I want to stay in Harlan Creek," he said. "I want to stay because of you specifically, and I want you to know that plainly because I'm not interested in pretending I don't. And what I'm wondering is whether there's a future here, for both of us." Together, he paused. "I'm not proposing tonight. I'm asking whether proposing is something you could see, eventually." Kate looked at him for a long moment in the September light coming through the high window. "Yes," she said, "I could see it." Something in his face loosened. "All right," he said. "All right," she said back. He picked up his fork and went back to his food, and she went back to hers, and the world continued to turn on its axis, but differently. Autumn came to the hill country in its slow, reluctant way, the heat releasing in stages, the pecans beginning to drop, the light changing from summer's white glare to something amber and horizontal that made everything look like a painting of itself. Kate loved October for this quality of light, and she had not loved it much for 3 years, and now she loved it again. She and Frank took to riding on Sunday afternoons after church, which gave the town something to appreciate and gave them an hour each week on horseback through the cedar breaks and the open draws where the deer grazed in the cooling evenings. Kate rode her own horse, a steady gray mare named Patience, who had been Thomas's horse originally and who Kate had kept out of both practical necessity and sentiment, and who had the particular virtue of being calm in traffic and steady on rocky ground. On one of these Sunday rides in late October, they came to the hill where Thomas was buried. It was not on the planned route, They had wandered further than usual, following a creek, and Kate pulled up when she saw the church and the small cemetery behind it. Frank pulled up beside her without being asked, reading the situation immediately. "Do you want to go over?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "if that's all right." "Of course it's all right," he said. They tied the horses and went through the low iron gate. Thomas's stone was simple, the way he had been, his name, the dates, and below them Kate's own choice. He loved faithfully. She stood before it with Frank beside her, not touching, just present, and she looked at the stone for a long time. "Thomas Dawson," she said quietly. "This is Frank Sutton. He is a good man." She felt her throat close for a moment and waited for it to ease. "He makes me laugh. He fixed the roof." She paused. "He's kind, Thomas. He is genuinely kind." Frank stood very still. "Thank you for the years we had," Kate said to the stone. "They were the best I'd known, and I'm going forward now. I wanted you to know." She stood a moment longer, and then she put her hand into her pocket and closed it around the watch and stood there with it warm in her palm, feeling its small ticking weight, and she thought about the 1,000 mornings she had wound it, the 1,000 times she had touched it throughout the 1,000 days, and she thought about what it meant to carry something and what it meant to eventually put it down. Not today. But she understood, standing there, that the day would come. She took her hand out of her pocket, empty, and turned back to Frank, and he was looking at her with those steady gray eyes, and there were no words needed, and they walked back to the horses together. In November, Roy Danforth threw a harvest supper for his hands and their families and the neighbors, and Frank brought Kate, and they sat together at the long plank table in the barn with the smell of hay and roasting meat, and the sound of fiddles warming up in the corner. And Frank poured her cider and she leaned against his shoulder briefly, just briefly, and he put his arm around her shoulders for a moment, and then they sat straight again in the company of others. But the moment had happened, and it carried warmth all through the evening. Sheriff Briggs stopped by their end of the table and made conversation, and regarded them both with the particular approval of a man who had watched this town for many years and had his own views on who belonged in it together. He did not say anything direct about it, but at the end of the conversation he shook Frank's hand and said, "Good to have you staying on," with a warmth that communicated considerably more. On the ride home, Frank said, "I spoke to Roy today about the foreman position." "I accepted." "I know," Kate said. "Roy told me himself. I think he was more excited than you were." "He's a good man," Frank said. "Fair, which counts for a great deal in an employer." "Yes," Kate said. They rode in companionable silence for a minute. "Frank." "Yes. I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly in my own time without waiting for the right moment to appear, because I've learned the right moment often doesn't appear on its own." He waited. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not saying it to push for anything or to change anything. I'm saying it because it's true and because I believe in saying true things." The horses walked on, their hooves steady in the dark road. "Kate," Frank said, and his voice was rougher than usual, "I have been in love with you since the second time I came into your store, when you were unpacking that crate of goods, and you told me the price of coffee without looking up, and then looked up and said good morning as though it were a separate and complete transaction." She laughed, a full and genuine laugh, into the November night. "That is a very specific memory," she said. "I have a great many specific memories of you," he said. She reached across the space between the horses and found his hand and held it, and they rode home hand in hand through the dark Texas night with the stars very large and clear overhead, and the cedar smell in the cold air and the horses breathing in rhythm. And Kate thought that if she could choose any moment to hold still and live inside forever, this might be among them. And then she thought that perhaps the point was not to hold it still, but to keep moving forward into more of them. December brought cold snaps and the preparations for Christmas and a letter from Frank's brother James in New Mexico, which Frank read twice and then told Kate about over lunch. "He wants to sell the rest of the cattle operation," Frank said. "He's been offered a good price and he wants me to agree to it since I have an old partial stake that's never been formally resolved." He folded the letter carefully. "I'll write him and tell him to sell. That chapter is finished." "Does it make you sad?" Kate asked. "A little," Frank said honestly, but less than I expected. I think because this, he looked around the small back room of the mercantile, the table, the window, the coffee pot, her. This feels more like home than that ever did after my parents died. Kate said nothing, but she felt the truth of it settle in her chest like something being confirmed. I want to ask you something, Frank said. You've been saying that for months now, she said. Ask it. He reached into his shirt pocket and brought out a ring. It was a simple thing, a thin gold band with a small turquoise stone, the color of the summer sky over New Mexico. He would tell her later. It was not extravagant. It was right. Kate Dawson, he said, will you marry me? She looked at the ring and then at his face, at the honest, steady face she had come to know, the storm-gray eyes that were right now more vulnerable than she had ever seen them, the jaw set with the specific tension of a man who has taken a great risk and is waiting for the verdict. Yes, she said. Frank Sutton, yes. His breath went out of him and he smiled, a full, unguarded, completely true smile that she had seen only a few times before and that each time made her feel as though the sun had moved slightly closer. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. I measured your ring finger while you were sleeping, he said immediately. She stared at him. I went by your house last Sunday while you were at Lily's and I measured the ring you left on your dresser, the silver one. He looked slightly horrified at himself. In retrospect, that's resourceful, she said firmly. That's resourceful. Yes, he agreed with great relief. She laughed so hard her eyes watered, and he laughed with her, and the small back room of the mercantile on the main street of Harlan Creek, Texas, in December of 1882, held more happiness in it than it had in some considerable time. They married in February of 1883, 4 years almost to the month since Thomas Dawson had died. Pastor Howell performed the ceremony. Lily Reeves stood up with Kate and Roy Danforth stood up with Frank, and the whole town came because weddings in small towns are communal events, and because everyone had been waiting. Kate wore a dress the color of cream with a garnet brooch at the throat, and she carried a small bunch of cedar and dried lavender, because the wildflowers were not yet up, and she liked the smell of cedar. And she walked down the aisle of the small white church with her chin level and her eyes on Frank's face, and the pocket watch in her right pocket, because she had debated whether to leave it at home, and found she could not. Frank's face when he saw her, she would remember that face for the rest of her life. The quality of it, the absolute openness of it, the complete absence of anything held back. Pastor Howell kept it short, as was his particular virtue, and they said their vows in clear voices with the February light coming through the plain glass windows and the whole town listening. And when it was done and Frank kissed her, there was considerable approval from the assembled. That evening, in the small celebration at the Grange Hall, Kate slipped away from the dancing for a moment and stood outside in the February cold with the stars above and the sound of the fiddle coming through the walls, and she took out the watch. She held it in both hands. She felt its weight, which she knew the way she knew her own heartbeat. She thought about 3 years and 4 months of mornings with this weight in her pocket. She thought about Thomas, who had been kind and steady and had loved her without reservation and had left too soon. She thought about what it meant that she was here in the February dark, married to Frank Sutton, with the watch in her hands. She was not giving it up. She was not erasing anything. She was simply standing in the new place she had arrived at. The door opened and Frank stepped out, carrying 2 glasses of cider, which he nearly spilled when he saw her face. He read her correctly in the way he always did and came to stand beside her without speaking for a moment. She held out the watch to him. He looked at it in her palm and then up at her face. "It's Thomas's," she said. "I've been carrying it for 3 years, for 3 years and a few months to be exact. I carried it because it was the last piece of him that kept regular time, that kept going forward the way he would have wanted things to keep going forward." She paused. "I've been thinking about when to put it down. I thought I might leave it here tonight, but then I thought it shouldn't sit in a drawer somewhere. It should be carried, it should be used." She pressed it into his hand. "It should be with someone who keeps good time," she said, "who keeps moving forward." Someone Thomas would have trusted with it if he'd had the chance to know them. Frank stood very still with the watch in his palm, looking at it with an expression she could not quite name, solemn and moved in something else, something that was almost recognition, as though he understood the magnitude of what was being placed in his hands. "Kate," he said. "Wind it in the morning," she said. "It'll keep perfect time. The crack in the crystal doesn't affect anything." Frank looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working through the meaning of this, what was being given and what was being trusted to him, and the understanding in his eyes when he arrived at the full weight of it made her throat tighten. "I'll carry it every day," he said. His voice was low and careful with the thing it was holding. "I will not let it stop." "I know," she said. He looked down at the watch in his palm for another moment, and then he closed his fingers around it, and then he reached for her with that hand, the one holding the watch, and cupped her face, and she leaned into it. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with it." "Thank you," she said, "for being the kind of man it makes sense to trust." He leaned his forehead against hers in the cold February night outside the Grange hall, with the fiddle playing inside and the stars overhead and the hill country dark stretching out in every direction, and they stood like that for a long moment, the watch between his palm and her cheek, and then they went back inside to dance. He did wind it the next morning. She heard him in the early dark before dawn, the small familiar sound of the stem being turned, and she lay in the new warmth of their shared bed and listened to it, and felt the particular peace of something continuing that should continue. The spring of 1883 opened around them like a hand unclenching. Frank settled fully into his foreman's position at the rocking D, which suited him the way serious work suits a serious man. He was up before dawn and home in the evenings, and when he came home with the particular contentment of a man who has spent the day doing something that matters to him. Kate kept the mercantile with the same care and competence she always had, but something in the daily work had lightened, and she noticed this not as an absence of something, but as the return of something, of ease, of being genuinely present in ordinary hours. They had a habit of eating supper together on the porch in good weather, watching the evening come over the hills, and talking. Kate thought privately that this habit, this porch in this light with this particular company, was one of the things she would count, in the accounting of her life, as a great good. Lily Reeves came to call on a Thursday in May and sat on the porch with Kate and looked at her with the bright, knowing look of a woman who has been waiting to deliver news. "Dr. Reeves says," Lily said, "that congratulations are in order." Kate looked at her. "You suspected," Lily said. "I thought it was possible," Kate said. "Since February I thought it was possible." "You're going to have a baby," Lily said, and beamed. Kate sat with it for a moment, the enormous, beautiful, terrifying fullness of it. "A baby," she said. "In October, I'd say," Lily said. "Maybe November." Kate sat very still, and then she put her face in her hands and cried, which surprised her, and then laughed, which surprised her less, and Lily sat beside her and held her hand and cried a little too, the way good friends do. Frank came home that evening to find Kate standing on the porch with a particular expression on her face. "What's happened?" he said immediately, swinging down from the horse. "Nothing's happened," she said. "Something is happening." He studied her face. "Frank," she said, "we're going to have a baby." The stillness that came over him was complete, total, the kind of stillness that is not absence but presence, everything concentrated in a single moment. "October," she said, "or November." He came up the porch steps and pulled her into his arms with a care that suggested he was already recalibrating how to handle the world with her in it, and she leaned into him and felt him breathe one deep breath, held, released, against her hair. "Kate," he said, "just her name." "I know," she said. He leaned back and looked at her face with the watch in his breast pocket between them, and something in his expression was so complete, so thoroughly present, that she would remember it precisely for the rest of her life. The summer was full. Kate kept the mercantile going through July and August with the assistance of a boy named Eli Breen, who she had taken on part-time, and who turned out to be capable of more than she expected if she was specific with her instructions. Frank checked on her condition with a frequency that she initially found charming and eventually found slightly excessive, which she told him plainly, and he pulled back by about 30%, which she acknowledged was a reasonable compromise. The town involved itself in the pregnancy with the communal interests small towns take in events of this nature. Mrs. Alderton brought over a basket of dried herbs she claimed were beneficial. Roy Danforth's wife, Me, appeared with a quilt she had made and pressed it into Kate's arms with such fierce affection that Kate nearly cried on the doorstep. Lily Reeves came by twice a week as a matter of habit and personal investment. Frank, who had never been a man to express anxiety openly, expressed it instead through action, through ensuring the wood box was always full, the water barrel always topped up, the porch steps carefully checked for any potential hazard, the roof inspected yet again in August to be entirely certain there were no new compromises in the cedar shingles. "You checked the roof in October," Kate told him. "And it's been a year," he said, already at the top of the ladder. She watched him from below and felt a wave of affection so strong it was almost disorienting. "Be careful," she called up. "Always," he called down. In September, with the baby approaching, Kate found herself returning in thought to Thomas more than she had in some months. Not with the old pain, which had become something gentler and more bearable, but with a kind of gratitude that surprised her in its completeness. She sat one evening on the porch while Frank was at the rocking D finishing the late-season work, and she thought about Thomas and Frank and the years between them, and she thought about how the pocket watch now sat in Frank's breast pocket, and she felt something that she could only describe as rightness. She had not stopped loving Thomas. She did not think she ever would, not entirely. But the love had shifted from a present, bleeding thing to something more like what a great river eventually becomes when it has been running for a long time, wide and deep and quiet, moving always in one direction. It carried its history with it. It did not need to announce itself. And Frank was here, and warm and real, and she loved him with the active, daily, choosing love of a woman who understands what love costs and chooses it anyway, every day, with full knowledge. She was 29 years old when Thomas died. She was 32 now and carrying a child, and had a husband who wound a dead man's watch every morning because she had asked him to, because he understood that some things should be honored and kept going even when the hands that first wound them were gone. This, she thought, was what she would tell the child someday, not just about its father, the one living, warm and present, but about the whole story of how it came to be, because all children deserve to know the full account of the people who made them. On the 15th of October, 1883, at 2 in the morning on a night so cool and clear that the stars were extraordinary, Kate Dawson Sutton gave birth to a boy. He came into the world in the way of all new things with considerable noise and effort, and a quality of startling realness that made everything around him seem, briefly, slightly less real by comparison. He was healthy and strong and angry about the cold, and when Lily Reeves put him in Kate's arms and Kate looked down at his face for the first time, she felt the specific and total love that she had heard described and not quite believed in until this moment. Frank was in the room. He had refused, categorically and with quiet firmness, to be removed to the waiting area. He stood at the head of the bed and held Kate's hand throughout, and when the baby came and they put him in her arms and she looked up at Frank, he was crying. She had never seen him cry before. It was the kind of crying that men who have held a great deal together for a long time do when something finally breaks through all of that holding, not weak, not showy, just honest, the way everything about him was honest. "Hello," she whispered to the baby. "Hello," Frank said softly also to the baby, leaning down to see his face. "His name," Kate said. They had discussed names. There had been considerable discussion. "Thomas Frank Sutton," Kate said, "if you still agree." Frank looked at her over the baby's head with the steady gray eyes that were bright with the crying, and nodded once. "Thomas Frank Sutton," he said. The baby, hearing his name for the first time, seemed briefly to consider it, and then went back to the business of breathing. In the morning, with the first light coming through the bedroom window, and Lily having gone home and the house very quiet, Frank sat in the chair beside the bed with the baby in his arms and Kate watching from the pillows, exhausted and wholly awake. She saw him reach into his breast pocket. He brought out the watch and held it in one hand while he held the baby in the other, looking at it. "I wound it before you woke up," he said quietly. "Didn't want to wake you." "I know," Kate said. "I heard it." He looked from the watch to the baby and back to the watch with an expression that she recognized as a man laying things side by side and understanding something. "3 years," he said softly. "You carried this for 3 years. 3 years, 4 months, and some days," she said. "And then you gave it to me." "And then I gave it to you," she agreed. "The same day you gave it to me was—" He stopped. "The day I married you," she finished. "Yes." He looked at her then with an expression that contained everything, the recognition of what she had done, what it had meant, the weight of it and the lightness of it, the past and the present, and this small new person in his arms who was the future made tangible. "Kate," he said. "I know," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead and then sat back and looked at the baby again, and she watched him. And outside the October morning was coming on with the particular clarity of hill country autumn, all gold and blue and smelling of cedar, and the season turning. The baby opened his eyes dark, still unfocused, working at this new world, and Frank put the watch back in his pocket and held him with both hands completely. Life in Harlan Creek in the years that followed had the quality that good lives often have, not of constant dramatic event, but of depth, of accumulation, of days that were ordinary and good, and seasons that move through their changes, and the specific richness that comes from being rooted in a place and a life you have chosen with full knowledge. Frank continued as foreman at the Rocking D, and in 1885, Roy Danforth gave him the stake he had promised, a partial ownership in the north section, which was 20 acres of good grazing land with a spring on it. Frank built a fence and bought 10 head of cattle to run on it as a beginning, and came home covered in cedar sawdust and entirely satisfied. Kate kept the mercantile and eventually hired Eli Breen permanently, and then, in 1886, took on a young woman named Clara Webb who had come to town with her family, and who had a particular facility for numbers that Kate recognized, and was not about to let go to waste. She taught Clara the accounts and the ordering and the management of stock, and the arrangement benefited both of them. Thomas Frank Sutton, who went by Tom from the beginning except when he was in trouble, which in early childhood was more often than anyone had fully anticipated, grew into a boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and a personality entirely his own, curious, relentless, affectionate to the point of occasionally being underfoot, possessed of an interest in horses that appeared at approximately age 3 and showed no signs of lessening. By 1885, Kate was certain she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier in body if not in management, since Tom had by this point entered a phase of maximum mobility combined with maximum curiosity and required significant attention. On an evening in late winter, she sat at the kitchen table doing accounts, while Frank sat across from her with Tom asleep in his lap, the boy having exhausted himself completely at some point after supper, and simply applied himself to his father like a barnacle and gone out. Frank was reading with one hand, and holding the sleeping child with the other with the practiced ease of a man who has made peace with impractical arrangements. Kate looked up from the ledger and looked at them, father and son, in the lamplight, and felt the accumulation of everything, Thomas in his grave on the hill, and the watch ticking in Frank's breast pocket, and this child asleep with his small face peaceful, and the new one coming in the summer, and the hill country dark outside the window, and this kitchen, and this table, and this man. "Frank," she said. He looked up. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that this is everything I hoped for. This exact thing. I want you to know I know that." He looked at her for a long moment with the lamplight on his face and Tom sleeping against his chest. "So do I," he said. She went back to the ledger. He went back to his book. Tom slept through all of it and drooled slightly on Frank's shirt, which Frank noticed and did not mention. In June of 1885, their second child arrived, another boy, whom they named William James Sutton. Well, for every day, James being Frank's brother's name, offered as a bridge across the distance between New Mexico and Texas. Will arrived in the daytime in summer, which suited his nature. He would prove to be a sunnier child than Tom in some ways, rounder and readier to laugh, though no less determined when he chose to be. James Sutton did, in fact, come from New Mexico that fall, having sold the cattle operation and invested the proceeds in a small ranch near Fredericksburg, which put him 2 hours' ride from Harlan Creek. He was taller than Frank and looser in his manner, and had their mother's quick laugh, and he arrived with a bottle of good whiskey and a carved wooden horse for Tom and a soft blanket for Will, and regarded Kate with such immediate warm approval that she liked him entirely. "She's better than you deserve," James told Frank over supper. "I know that," Frank said. "Good," James said, and served himself more beans. Tom watched this exchange with great interest and filed it away. The years moved in their way. The town grew slowly, as hill country towns did, and brought new faces and new stories, and Kate watched them arrive from her window behind the mercantile counter the way she had always watched. The railroad came through a county over in 1887, which changed the ordering logistics and improved the supply lines considerably. Sheriff Briggs retired, and his deputy, a man named Carter who was young and earnest and learning, took his place. Frank's 20 acres became 30, and then 40, as he was methodical and patient about the expansion, adding a few head each year as the land could support. By 1888, the Sutton cattle operation was small but solid, and he talked about it with Tom in the evenings with the seriousness of a man building something for a specific future. Tom, age 5, was deeply interested. Will, age 3, was deeply interested in the horses and mildly interested in everything else. Kate observed all of this with the pleasure of a woman who has had the particular experience of knowing great sorrow, and who therefore does not take great happiness as its natural or guaranteed state, but as a thing that requires tending and appreciation. She went to the cemetery on Thomas's birthday every January, as she had done every year since his death, and she stood before his stone and spoke to him in the quiet way she had developed, telling him what was new, what had changed, what the boys were doing, how the mercantile was going. In January of 1888, Frank came with her for the first time. He had offered before, and she had always gone alone, but this year she said yes, and they walked up the hill to the cemetery together in the cold January morning with the grass brown and the sky very clear and blue. She said what she usually said, standing at the stone: "The boys and the mercantile and the year just ended." And then she said, "Thomas, I brought him with me this time. I thought you should be properly introduced." Frank stood beside her with his hat in his hands and his eyes steady on the stone. "I'm going to keep winding the watch," Frank said quietly to the stone, "as long as it keeps running." Kate felt her throat close. They stood in the cold for another minute and then walked back down the hill together, Frank's arm around her shoulders, the grass crunching under their feet. "Thank you," Kate said, "for coming." "Thank you for letting me," he said. In the spring of 1889, Kate discovered she was expecting a third time, which she announced to Frank with a combination of delight and pragmatism that he found entirely characteristic. "I need to talk to Clara about expanding her responsibilities," she said, "because I will not be able to manage the full store in August." "Hello to you too," Frank said. "We are having another baby," she clarified. "I thought that was understood." "It is now," he said, smiling. This child was a girl, born in November of 1889, and they named her Margaret Grace Sutton, Maggie from the first day, and she arrived with an expression of such focused intensity that both parents stood looking at her with the slight alarm of people who recognize in a newborn the particular quality of a personality that will require all available resources to match. Tom, 6 years old, regarded his new sister with the wariness of a boy who senses a change in the order of things. Will, 4, was enchanted, and attempted to give her his carved wooden horse, which was his most valued possession. Maggie looked at the horse with those focused eyes and made a sound of approval, and Will beamed, and Tom decided to reserve judgment. Frank held Maggie the way he had held each of the others, completely, and with a thoroughness of attention that Kate had noticed from the first time with Tom, as though each new person he was given to hold was something he intended to take seriously as a charge. He held her and reached into his breast pocket and brought out the pocket watch and held it near her in the way he had done with both boys, not dangling it for her to grab, just showing it, the way you show a person something important and real. "That's your grandfather's watch," he said to Maggie, who could obviously not understand a word. "His name was Thomas Dawson. He was a good man. You come from him too, through your mother, and I want you to know that." Kate stood in the doorway watching and felt something so full she could not speak. She did not try. Life continued its good and daily way. The boys grew with the speed that children grow, which is always faster than parents expect and slower than they fear in the nights of worry. Tom turned into a capable, serious-minded boy with an instinct for cattle that Roy Danforth said was the kind of thing you were either born with or not. Will turned into a warm and social child who seemed to know everyone in town by age 8 and was constitutionally unable to pass a person without saying hello. Maggie remained herself focused, determined, alarming, and deeply loved. Frank and Kate had been married 7 years when Kate stood at the mercantile window one spring morning in 1890 and watched the main street of Harlan Creek in the early light, and thought about the morning she had stood at this same window and watched a stranger ride in on a big bay gelding from the north. She thought about all the mornings since. About the quality of a life built in a particular place with particular people, how it accumulated like good soil, slowly, and through the deposit of 10,000 small things, until it was something that could hold and sustain whatever was planted in it. She heard Frank's step on the porch. He had walked with her and the children this morning for the school run, a habit on Tuesdays, and the door opened, and the bell rang, and he came in with the April cold still on his coat and his hat in his hand and looked at her standing at the window. "Good morning," he said, in the voice she knew as well as her own heartbeat. "Good morning," she said. He came behind the counter and stood beside her and looked out the window with her at the town in the morning light, and she felt the solidity of him, the specific and particular reality of this man, this partner, this love. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "I'm looking at everything." He put his arm around her waist and she leaned into him, and they stood at the window together in the April morning, looking out at the street and the town and the hills beyond. And above them, in the sky just clearing to full blue, the spring was absolute. Later, she would try to account for all of it, the grief and the years of carrying it, the slow and then sudden way the grief had made room for something new. The morning she had handed the watch across a counter and given it to its new keeper on the day she gave herself to him. She would tell the children when they were old enough, and she would tell them plainly the way she told everything, because she believed in the plain truth of things. She would tell them about their father Thomas Dawson, who lay on the hill behind the church and had been a good man. She would tell them about the watch, brass-cased with the cracked crystal, and the 3 years she had carried it. She would tell them about a stranger riding in from the north on a big bay horse on a Tuesday morning in April of 1882, and the way he had taken her watch and her heart on the same evening, and kept them both. She would tell Maggie, specifically when Maggie was old enough, that grief is not a problem to be solved but a country to be crossed, and that crossing it does not mean abandoning what you left behind, but rather carrying it forward into the new territory, into the place where it can become something that enriches rather than only wounds. She would tell Tom that his name was 2 names, and what each one meant, and that being named for the dead is not a burden but a kind of conversation across time, the living speaking to the gone. She would tell Will that his laugh was his best inheritance. But that was later. Now she stood at the window with Frank's arm around her, in the April morning, in the mercantile that was hers and had always been hers, in the town where she had come as a young wife, and stayed as a widow, and stayed again as a woman who had found her way back to love through the patient, honest work of grief and time, and the specific mercy of a man with gray eyes who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly what she was. Outside, a wagon came down the main street, and two cowboys rode in from the east, and a woman with a basket walked along the plank sidewalk in front of the barber shop, and the morning continued its ordinary becoming. The watch ticked against Frank's ribs, steady as a second heartbeat, carrying perfect time forward into the day. Kate Dawson Sutton felt it from where she stood, pressed close against his side, and she smiled. The crickets would come back in summer, and the pecans would drop in fall, and the cold would come as it always came, and then the spring again. And through all of it, the watch would tick in the breast pocket of a man who wound it every morning as a promise kept, as an honor paid, as a love sustained, not one love, but all the loves, layered and alive and moving forward together into everything that was still to come, which was considerable, which was good, which was more than enough, and then more than that. The door of the mercantile opened, letting in the April air, and a customer came in, and Kate stepped forward from the window to meet them, carrying nothing in her pocket now but her own warm hands, her life having grown large enough to carry itself.